The banker slammed the foreclosure notice down on the table so hard that the coffee cups rattled. "Get out," Victor Hale said, his voice the kind of quiet that was worse than shouting. "Take your daughter and get out of my house, tonight." Margaret Hale didn't move. She had married this man 23 years ago. She had buried 2 children in the ground beside this house. She had sewn curtains for every window and planted roses along the fence that hadn't bloomed yet this spring. "Victor, I said tonight." Eliza stood in the doorway of the kitchen, a dish towel still in her hands, watching her mother's face go very still, the way it did when she was trying not to shatter in front of someone who didn't deserve her tears. "If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you built with your own hands, stay with me, because this story is just getting started. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Eliza's journey to the very end. You won't want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Eliza Hale turned 31, she woke up in the back of a wagon with nothing but a canvas bag, a wool blanket that smelled like cedar, and the quiet, devastating certainty that her life as she had known it was finished. Her mother sat on the buckboard, holding the reins with both hands, even though the old horse, Biscuit, hadn't needed guiding in years. Margaret Hale was 62, with white hair she kept pinned severely at the back of her neck, and a face that had been handsome once, still was in the right light, but had been worn smooth by decades of disappointment the way river stones are worn smooth by water. She didn't say anything. She had not said very much since the night Victor Hale had handed them a lantern and pointed toward the road. Eliza watched the scrub grass flatten in the wind and tried to remember when exactly everything had gone wrong. The answer, she supposed, was gradual, the way most catastrophes are. Not a single explosion, but a slow accumulation of small failures, each one so minor it seemed survivable until they weren't anymore. She had been married once. That was the first failure. His name was Thomas, and he had seemed decent enough when she was 24 and still believed that decent was sufficient. It wasn't. He had left after 2 years, citing nothing specific and everything general, and Eliza had learned that the most humiliating kind of abandonment is the kind where the person leaving cannot even articulate a reason. At least grief you can name has edges. The other kind just spreads. She'd gone back to her mother's house after that. Her stepfather, Victor, had tolerated her presence the way a man tolerates a piece of furniture he didn't choose, neither acknowledging it nor quite moving it. She had taken work where she could find it, mending clothes, helping at the dry goods store, cooking for the school teacher who had arthritis in both hands and couldn't manage a pot anymore. None of it amounted to much. People in Millhaven were polite about it, mostly, but polite in that particular frontier way that contains its own kind of cruelty. The lowered eyes, the brief pause before answering, the way conversations shifted when she walked into a room. The divorced woman. That was how they said it, like it was a category of person rather than a thing that had happened to a person. Victor's ultimatum had come on a Tuesday. He'd lost money on a cattle deal gone bad, which had been happening with increasing regularity over the past 3 years, and he needed to feel powerful over something. Eliza understood that clinically, the way you understand weather. It doesn't make getting rained on any less wet. He told Margaret she could stay if she sent Eliza away. Margaret had looked at her husband for a long time, and then she had gone to her room and begun to pack a bag, and that was the only answer she gave. Eliza had not asked her to do that. She wanted to say so, still, every time she looked at her mother's straight back on the buckboard. But Margaret Hale was not a woman you argued with about the things that mattered. She had made her decision in silence, and she would live in it the same way. They had $34 between them. A horse, a wagon, 2 bags of clothes, a box of kitchen tools, and a ham wrapped in cloth that was going to last them maybe 4 more days before it turned. They had a name, a single name, pulled from a conversation Margaret had overheard at the feed store 3 weeks prior, before any of this had happened. A rancher named Ethan Caldwell, out past the Eastern Ridge, was apparently in some kind of trouble and might be willing to take on hired help. Might be. It wasn't much, but it was the only direction they had. The Eastern Ridge was farther than it looked, the way distances always were in this country. They rode through the better part of the morning and into the early afternoon, the sun sitting on them like something personal before the track crested a hill and Eliza got her first look at the Caldwell place. She had expected worse, somehow, and that itself was telling. She had calibrated her expectations so low that she had to actively remind herself the place was in genuine trouble. The main house stood solid enough, a two-story timber structure that had been well built once and showed it in the bones. But the yard around it had gone feral. Fence posts leaned at angles. A gate hung from one hinge, swinging in the dry wind with a sound like a complaint that nobody was answering. The garden, which should have been a month into its spring planting by now, was a rectangle of hard, pale dirt with a few dead stalks at the edges that no one had pulled. A man came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He was maybe 45, Eliza thought. Hard to tell exactly because he was the kind of person who seemed to have arrived at his current age in a rush and then stopped there, like a clock running fast and then going still. He was lean, the way men get lean when they're working too much and eating too little, and he had a face that looked like it had been through weather that was sometimes metaphorical. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt and watched them come down the track without any particular expression, and that absence of expression told Eliza quite a lot. A man who greets strangers on his property with nothing is a man who has learned to expect very little from what arrives. He let them get all the way to the fence line before he spoke. "Help you?" 2 words. Not rude, but not warm either, just positioned. Margaret drew Biscuit to a stop with the light, competent authority she brought to everything. "We're looking for Ethan Caldwell." "You found him." "I'm Margaret Hale. This is my daughter Eliza. We were told you might be in need of hired help." Something moved behind his eyes. Not hope, exactly. More like the suppressed reflex of a man who had taught himself not to feel hope because it hadn't been useful. "Who told you that?" "Fella named Greer, at the feed store in Millhaven. We weren't eavesdropping. He was speaking loudly." Ethan Caldwell looked at them for a moment. Then he looked past them at the empty track they'd come down, as if checking whether there was anyone else, any larger group, that made more sense of this. There wasn't. It was just the 2 women and the old horse and the wagon. "Come down then," he said finally. "Water your horse." He didn't offer them coffee right away, which Eliza noted. Not because it was unkind, but because it meant he was waiting to see what they were before he made that level of commitment. She understood the calculation. She had done it herself. They stood in the yard while he filled the water trough for Biscuit, and Eliza looked around with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent years maintaining other people's spaces. The fence situation was worse than it looked from the hill. 3 full sections down, not just leaning. The barn door needed rehinging. The garden soil was workable, she thought, if it was turned and amended soon, but the window was closing. 2 more weeks and the season would be compromised. "What happened to your workers?" Margaret asked. She had a directness that some people found alarming. Ethan straightened up from the trough. "Left. One by one, over the past year." He didn't offer more than that. "Why?" He looked at her. "Town's got opinions about how a man ought to run his operation. I didn't agree. Men who need a town's approval to feel comfortable in their work went elsewhere." Margaret nodded slowly, like she was filing this information in a specific place. "And the bank?" The pause before he answered was its own kind of answer. "Why are you asking about the bank?" "Because that's usually the other piece." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned away and looked at the fence line. "I have debt. I have 60 days on a note that I can't cover without a good season, and I can't have a good season without help, and I can't get help because the men in this county won't work for a man the town's decided to punish." He said it flatly, without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. "That what you wanted to know?" "Yes," Margaret said. "What are your terms for hired help?" He turned back to look at them both, and this time his gaze paused on Eliza with a frankness that wasn't rude, but was thorough. She met it straight. She had been assessed her whole life. She had learned not to look away. "Work hard," he said. "Do what needs doing. Don't ask me to explain myself to the town. And don't expect me to protect you from what they think." He paused. "You earn your place. That's the only terms I've got." Margaret looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at her mother. Something passed between them. Not words, just the compressed communication of two people who have survived the same hard seasons. "All right," Margaret said. "We'll start in the morning." The first morning established the pattern that would define the weeks that followed, though none of them knew it at the time. Eliza was up before the sun, not because anyone had told her to be, there was no one to tell her, but because the work she had catalogued in her mind the night before had a pressure to it, a weight that wouldn't let her lie still. She found the kitchen in a state of functional chaos, pots that needed scrubbing, a larder that had been raided by mice at some point and never properly reorganized, a stove that required coaxing with 3 separate adjustments before it would draw properly. She coaxed it. By the time Ethan came down, there was coffee on, and the kitchen smelled like something that had been thought about. He stopped in the doorway. Not shocked exactly, but recalibrating. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," Eliza said. She handed him a cup without looking up from the stove. "Fence posts, the ones on the north side, is that wood usable or does it need to come out?" A pause. "Some of it's usable." "Where are the tools?" "Barn, back left, behind the saddle rack." "All right." She heard him sit down at the table, heard the creak of the chair, the small sound of him wrapping his hands around the cup. When she finally looked over, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something guarded, something tired, something that was trying very hard not to be grateful because gratitude in a man like this had to be earned before it could be spent. "You've done this kind of work before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've done all kinds of work," she said. He nodded, didn't push. She respected that. Marsh doesn't like being turned down politely. He'd rather be fought. At least that gives him something to push against. Eliza set the basket of eggs on the fence post and looked out at the ranch, the yard, the barn, the leaning gate still swinging in the morning wind, the 2-story house with its bones of good timber. She thought about the numbers she'd half heard being turned over in the office last night. "What do you know about the original note?" she asked. "I know it was written 3 years ago when Caldwell needed to expand the herd. And I know the terms were adjusted twice since then in ways Caldwell probably didn't read as carefully as he should have. I'm not saying he was careless. I'm saying Marsh's banker is very good at making adjustments sound like favors." Eliza looked at her. "Do you know what the current terms say? Exactly?" Ruth Alderman gave her a long look. "You're not what I expected," she said. "People keep saying that," Eliza said. Something shifted in Ruth's face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "No, I don't know the exact terms, but I know a man in town who does. Name's Hector Blaine. He's a notary, and he keeps records of everything he's ever touched because he doesn't trust anyone, which in this county is not paranoia, it's experience." She paused. "He and Marsh have history, not good history. Could he be persuaded to look at those terms?" "He might be persuaded if someone asked him the right way." Ruth picked up the empty basket from where Eliza had set it. "I'm not saying I'm part of whatever you're planning. My husband would say I've already said too much." "You haven't said anything," Eliza said. "You brought eggs." That did get a smile, brief and real, and Ruth Alderman climbed back onto her wagon, gathered the reins, and then paused. "The men Marsh sent out here Thursday," she said. "Word gets around. I want you to know. Not everyone in this county is made of the same material as Doyle Marsh. Some of us are just scared. There's a difference." She drove away without waiting for a response, and Eliza stood at the fence for a moment watching the wagon go, turning over what she'd been given. Then she picked up the garden fork and went back to work. She didn't tell Ethan about Ruth Alderman that evening. Not because she was keeping it from him, but because she hadn't yet decided what shape to make of it, and she had learned a long time ago that incomplete information offered prematurely has a way of becoming noise instead of signal. She filed it. She kept working. The second week unfolded with a rhythm that surprised her by feeling almost normal. She was up before dawn, coffee on, stove coaxed, kitchen ordered, garden in the morning until her back made its complaints too specific to ignore, then fence work in the afternoon, or the barn, or whatever Ethan had identified as the next most urgent thing. Margaret had taken over the house itself with the quiet authority of a woman who had been managing households since before Eliza was born. She scrubbed and repaired and organized with a systematic precision that made the interior of the Caldwell house begin, slowly, to breathe differently. Less like a place that had given up, more like a place that was thinking about trying again. Ethan worked alongside them, not managing, not supervising, working. She had half expected him to have the habit some men have of directing other people's labor while holding himself slightly apart from it. But he didn't. He was up before she was most mornings, already out in the barn or on the fence line, and he stayed out until the light was gone, and sometimes after. He was the kind of person who didn't talk a great deal while working, but was fully present in the work itself, which Eliza found easier to be around than the alternative. They developed a shorthand, not quickly and not without some friction. There was a morning in the second week where they disagreed about the approach to the south pasture fence, and the disagreement had edges on it, and neither of them handled it with particular grace. Ethan got quiet in the way that was actually louder than speaking. Eliza said something sharper than she intended. They avoided each other for the better part of that afternoon and came back to the supper table with the specific, careful politeness of people who have decided, separately, that the fight cost more than it was worth. "The stone anchors will hold better," she said, halfway through the meal. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "They will." That was as close as either of them came to an apology, and it was enough. Margaret watched this exchange with an expression of complete neutrality that only a very perceptive person would have identified as satisfaction. It was toward the end of the second week that Eliza finally went to town. She needed supplies that the ranch didn't have. Specific hardware for the fence repairs, seeds for the garden, a length of rope. Ethan offered to go himself, and she said no without making a large thing of it, just a quiet no with a reason attached. She needed to see the town herself, and she needed the town to see her, and it was better to get that over with early rather than let it build into something that had more power than it deserved. Harrow was not a large town. One main street, a feed store, a dry goods, a bank with a painted sign that said First Regional and looked more permanent than most things in the county. A barber, a small hotel, a saloon that did most of its real business at a back table rather than the front bar. Eliza drove Biscuit down the main street at a pace that was unhurried without being defiant, which was its own kind of defiance. She felt the looks. Of course she felt them. You don't spend years as the person people look at sideways and lose the ability to sense it. You just learn to carry it differently. She was coming out of the hardware store with her purchases when she nearly walked into a woman who was coming in. The woman stopped short. Mid-40s, dressed with the particular care of someone whose social position required maintenance. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on a version of pleasant that had been prepared in advance and had nothing to do with how she actually felt. "You must be one of the women staying at the Caldwell place," she said. "Eliza Hale," Eliza said. She shifted the hardware bag to her left hand and extended her right. The woman looked at the extended hand for just a fraction of a second too long before shaking it. "Helen Marsh." "The wife, then." Eliza kept her face entirely still. "Nice to meet you," she said. "I hope you're settling in all right," Helen Marsh said, with the inflection of someone who hoped the opposite. "It must be quite a change for you." "Everything's a change, eventually," Eliza said pleasantly. Helen Marsh looked at her with eyes that were sharper than her voice. "You know, my husband thinks very highly of Ethan Caldwell. He'd hate to see the man lose everything over something that could have been avoided." "I imagine he would," Eliza said. "There are options. There are always options." She paused. "A sensible woman in your position might encourage Mr. Caldwell to consider them." Eliza looked at Helen Marsh for a long moment. The woman was not stupid. That was clear. She was the kind of woman who had spent years being the acceptable face of her husband's dealings, and she had gotten good at it, and she probably knew exactly what she was doing right now and had made her peace with knowing it. "I'm going to be honest with you," Eliza said, keeping her voice conversational. "I've been told what sensible women in my position should do by a lot of people, and it's never quite worked out to mean what I actually think it means." She picked up her bag. I'll let Mr. Caldwell know you send your regards." She drove home with the hardware and the seeds and the rope and a cold, clear certainty settling in her chest that what Ruth Alderman had told her was true, and that the time for simply working and waiting was probably shorter than she had hoped. She told Ethan about both conversations that evening. He sat at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a while in a way that was not comfortable but was genuine. "Hector Blaine," he said, "you know him?" "I know of him." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I never went to him because I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I thought I understood what I signed. I thought I'd read it carefully enough." "You probably did read it carefully," Eliza said. "That's not the same as understanding what was in it if someone was good enough at writing it." He looked up at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability, exactly, because he would have resisted that word, but an acknowledgement that he had been operating with incomplete information and that this cost him something. A man like Ethan Caldwell didn't like owing debts of that kind. Not to banks and not to his own blind spots. "I'll go see Blaine," she said. "That's my business," he said. Not harshly, just directly. "It is," she said. "And if you want to go alone, go alone. I'm not trying to take it from you." She paused. "But Ruth Alderman said he might need approaching a particular way, and I think a woman asking him to look at a loan document is a different thing than the man who took out the loan asking him. It's harder to say no to. The stakes read differently." Ethan looked at her for a long time. He was doing the calculation she could see him doing, the pride of it against the practicality of it, which was a calculation men like him made more often than they admitted, and the good ones eventually got right. "Fine," he said. She went to see Hector Blaine the following Monday while Ethan was repairing the barn roof, a job that needed doing and that kept him on the property, which was where she needed him. Blaine's office was behind the notary sign next to the barber, up a narrow staircase that creaked on every step in a pattern that was probably not accidental. A man in his position would want to hear people coming. He was smaller than she expected, white-haired, with the kind of precise tidiness in his personal space that suggested he lived alone and had made his arrangements with himself. He looked up when she came in and waited. She told him who she was and where she worked and what she wanted, directly and without preamble, because she had learned that men like Hector Blaine respected a clear question more than a careful approach. He was quiet for a while after she finished. "You know what Marsh would say if he found out I looked at that document," he said. "I imagine he'd say something," Eliza agreed. "He'd say more than something." But his hands were already moving toward the filing cabinet beside his desk, which told her the decision had already been made. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right question about that note for 2 years," he said. "Caldwell never came." There was something in his voice, not quite reproach, not quite sorrow. "I couldn't go to him, wasn't my place. But I noticed things when that document crossed my desk, and noticing things and doing nothing about them is—" He stopped. "It sits on you," he said finally. She waited while he found the file. He laid it out on the desk and put on a pair of spectacles that he produced from his breast pocket, and he read, and she read alongside him. And about 6 minutes into reading, she found the clause that changed the shape of everything. It was written in the middle of a paragraph about interest rate adjustments, embedded in language so technical and specific that it would be easy to read past it, had probably been designed to be read past it. The clause allowed the bank to accelerate the loan to full immediate repayment under certain conditions, and one of those conditions was worded broadly enough that it could, with a specific interpretation, be triggered by the very act of hiring outside labor without the bank's prior approval. Eliza read it twice. "They wrote this so they could call it in whenever they wanted," she said. "That's correct." Blaine's voice was careful and even. "And the adjustment that added this clause, when was that?" "Second year of the loan, 18 months after the original note." "And Ethan Caldwell signed the adjustment?" "He signed a form indicating he'd received notification of updated terms. Whether he understood what was in those terms is—" Blaine removed his spectacles. "That is the question, isn't it?" Eliza sat back in the chair. She was thinking about Ethan at his kitchen table, turning the coffee cup in his hand, saying, "I thought I'd read it carefully enough." She was thinking about Doyle Marsh's wife in front of the hardware store, talking about options and sensible women. She was thinking about 60 days on a clock that Marsh could apparently, if he chose, decide to interpret differently at any moment. What would it mean, she said slowly, if someone were to document that the clause was added under conditions that Caldwell didn't fully understand, that the notification was drafted in a way designed to obscure rather than explain? Blaine looked at her. It would mean someone had standing to challenge the legality of that clause. In writing? If someone were willing to put it in writing, yes. He was quiet for a moment. I am a notary. I certify documents. I do not make legal arguments. A pause. But I do certify what I observe. And what did you observe? He picked up his spectacles again and looked at the document. I observed a clause of significant financial consequence embedded in language that, in my professional judgment, was not written to be understood by the average person reading it in the normal course of reviewing a loan modification. Eliza looked at him. Would you be willing to put that in writing? She asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she became aware of the street sounds below. A wagon, voices, the ordinary sound of a town going about its ordinary business. Not today, he said. I need to think about it. Of course, she said. She stood up and gathered her things and was almost to the door when he spoke again. Miss Hale. She turned. He was looking at the file, not at her. You tell Caldwell to stop walking around that ranch like a man who's already lost. That's the thing that worries me most. When a man starts moving like he's defeated, the people who want him defeated start believing it. She nodded. I'll tell him. She went back down the creaking staircase and out into the street, and she stood for a moment in the afternoon light, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. The particular fragile shape of a situation that was bad but not yet finished. The difference between a fight that was over and a fight that was still happening. She drove home. Ethan was off the barn roof by the time she got back, washing at the well with the methodical care of a man removing evidence of a day's work. He turned when he heard the wagon. She told him. All of it. The clause. Blaine's observation. What it might mean and what it might cost and what she thought they ought to do about it. He listened without moving, water dripping from his hands, the sun going down behind the ridge in gradations of orange that neither of them was paying attention to. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. He'd do it? He said. Blaine would put that in writing? He said he needs to think about it. I believe he will. Another silence. Why? Why would he take that risk? Because it's been sitting on him, she said. That's what he told me. Ethan turned away and looked at the fence line, the same fence they'd argued about, the same fence she'd helped him repair with stone anchors that would hold. The pasture beyond it had started to show color again, tentatively, cautiously, the way things come back when they've been neglected rather than destroyed. There's a difference, she said quietly, between a debt you actually owe and one that was written to make sure you'd never be able to pay it. He turned back to her. I should have looked harder. Yes, she said. She didn't soften it. He didn't need it softened. And now you know what you're dealing with. That's different from not knowing. He nodded. Slowly, with the reluctant precision of a man accepting an unpleasant truth that is nonetheless better than the alternative. I'll need to pay Blaine, he said, whatever he charges. We'll figure it out. The we landed between them without either of them remarking on it, and Eliza went inside to start the evening meal, and she heard Ethan stand in the yard for a while before he followed, the same way he had that first night, as if he needed a moment with the open air before he could come back in under a roof. The following days carried their own accumulation of small tensions and small victories, the kind that don't announce themselves but add up. The garden began to show green along the second row, thin shoots that were improbably hopeful in the dry air. The north fence held through a wind that came down from the ridge Thursday night and had enough force to it that Eliza lay awake listening to it press against the house. The south pasture gate had been rehung properly and opened cleanly now, which was such a small thing, and yet every time she heard it, she felt something release in her chest. Margaret had made an arrangement with the chickens Ethan kept in the far yard. An arrangement, Eliza said, because that was the only word for it. Her mother went out each morning and spoke to the chickens in a low, specific voice, and the chickens had begun producing more eggs than they had in months, which Ethan reported with the baffled expression of a man encountering something he couldn't explain and had decided not to question. The trouble came back at the end of the third week, as trouble tends to do when it has not been adequately answered. This time it wasn't Marsh's men. It was Marsh himself. He came alone, which was either confidence or a calculated performance of confidence. With men like him, the difference was hard to locate. He was older than Eliza had imagined, 60 or near enough, with the specific quality of a man who has spent decades being powerful and has absorbed it into his posture so thoroughly that he probably didn't notice it anymore. He rode a gray horse and wore a good hat, and he was perfectly, deliberately civil, which was how she knew immediately that this was the most dangerous visit yet. He asked for Ethan by name. Eliza had come out of the barn when she heard the hooves, and she stood in the yard and told him Ethan was on the property and she'd get him. And she saw the slight pause Marsh took when she said it, the recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of reception. She didn't hurry. She walked to the south pasture at a normal pace and told Ethan he had a visitor and who it was, and she watched his face go through a brief, controlled sequence of reactions before settling into something flat and deliberate. "You want me to stay back?" she asked. "No," he said, and the answer was immediate enough that it surprised her. "Come." They walked back together, and Marsh was still on his horse when they reached him, which was a choice. A man who stays mounted when greeting someone on their own property is saying something about how he sees the relative positions. Ethan stopped at a distance that was correct and looked up at him. "Marsh." "Caldwell." Marsh's voice was easy, reasonable, the voice of a man here to have a productive conversation. "I've been meaning to ride out, just to talk." "Talk, then." Marsh glanced at Eliza with the brief, measuring look of a man cataloging a variable. She met it straight, the way she always did. "Your situation," Marsh said. "I'm aware it's difficult. I want you to know I'm not your enemy here, whatever you might have heard." "I haven't heard anything," Ethan said. "I've just been watching." A small pause. Marsh adjusted his hat brim with 2 fingers, a minimal gesture that contained within it the entire apparatus of a man deciding how much directness to deploy. "My bank has a note on this property. You're aware the terms are coming up." "I'm aware." "I'd like to make you another offer. A fair offer, Caldwell. Fairer than what you turned down 5 years ago. The land, the water rights included. Enough to clear your debt and have something left over to start fresh somewhere else." He paused. "There's no shame in knowing when something isn't working. A man's not a failure because the land beats him." Eliza watched Ethan's face while Marsh spoke. She saw the thing she had seen from the beginning, the exhaustion in him, the way he had been carrying this alone for so long that the weight had become hard to distinguish from his own posture. She saw him absorb Marsh's offer with the particular stillness of a man who is genuinely calculating, genuinely unsure, and she felt, for a moment, the cold possibility that he might say yes. "The water rights," Eliza said. Both men looked at her. She kept her eyes on Marsh. "You keep mentioning them. Water rights included." She tilted her head. "Why include that specifically, in a conversation that's supposed to be about offering someone a fair way out of debt?" Marsh's expression didn't change, but something shifted underneath it, the way water shifts under ice. "I'm being transparent about what the offer covers." "You're being specific about the piece that matters most to you," she said. "That's not the same thing." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. When he looked back at Ethan, there was something different in his face now, a quality of attention that was less performance and more actual. "You've got yourself an unusual situation here, Caldwell," he said. "I've got people who work hard," Ethan said. His voice had changed while they were talking. It had gotten quieter and more certain, which Eliza had begun to understand was what Ethan Caldwell sounded like when he had made a decision. "That's what I've got." Marsh looked at them both for a moment. Then he touched his hat brim, a minimal farewell, turned the gray horse, and rode back up the track without hurrying. They stood in the yard and watched him go. "The water rights," Ethan said after a while. "If he controls the water on the eastern creek, he controls what 3 other properties downstream can do," Eliza said. "Including Ruth Alderman's." He turned and looked at her. "You knew that." Ruth told me, the first week. He absorbed this without apparent anger, which she had come to understand was a thing about him. He was capable of receiving information that should have been given earlier without making the lateness of it the issue. He dealt with what was in front of him. So this was never about the debt, he said. It was always about the water. He turned back to look at the track where Marsh had gone, now just a settling of dust above the grass. He'll find another way to come at us. Yes, she said. He will. She said us without thinking about it, the same way she'd said we before, and this time Ethan caught it. She could see that he caught it, in the way his posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if something had been redistributed inside him. He didn't say anything about it. He just stood there in the yard, in the late afternoon, looking at the fence line they'd fixed together, the garden showing its thin, hopeful green, the barn with its rehung door, and the land beyond it that someone powerful had decided was worth taking by means that were too careful and too slow to easily fight. I need to talk to more of the neighbors, he said. Yes, Eliza said. He stopped. I've been doing this like it was my problem to solve alone. You have, she said. She kept her voice level. That's been the problem. He looked at her sideways. Not angry, not defensive, something more honest than either of those and more uncomfortable. You could have said that differently, he said. I know, she said, but you needed to hear it the way I said it. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, compressed, involuntary, surprised out of him. And then he walked toward the barn, and Eliza stood in the yard a moment longer, feeling the last of the day's heat on her face, thinking about everything that needed to happen next, and how little time they had to make it happen. She didn't know yet what she was going to have to offer to change the equation. She didn't know yet what it would cost, but she had spent 31 years learning that the cost of not trying was always higher than the cost of trying and failing, and that knowledge sat in her the way the garden's green sat in the dry earth, quietly, stubbornly, with no interest at all in being doubted. She went inside to think, and the door of the Caldwell house closed behind her with the solid, unhurried sound of a place that was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, how to be a home again. The talking to neighbors that Ethan had proposed turned out to be harder than either of them anticipated, which should not have been surprising, but was, anyway. The way things you know intellectually are going to be difficult still manage to disappoint you when you encounter them in practice. He went out the following week, riding to 3 properties in the Eastern Valley. Men he had known for years, some of them since before the trouble with Marsh had started acquiring its current shape. He came back the first evening without having accomplished much, which he reported to Eliza at supper with the flat, controlled tone of a man managing his frustration by keeping it at a distance. Alderman was decent, he said, listened, but he said he couldn't commit to anything without knowing more about what I was actually asking. That's fair, Eliza said. The Fowler brothers said they'd think about it. He pushed food around his plate, which is what people say when they've already decided no and don't want to have the conversation. Margaret, who had been eating in her customary focused silence, said, without looking up, "What exactly did you ask them?" Ethan looked at her. "I told them about Marsh, about the water rights, about what would happen to the downstream properties if he got control of the Eastern Creek." "And what did you ask them to do?" A pause. "I said I needed support, that I couldn't fight this alone." Margaret set down her fork with the gentle precision of a woman depositing something she'd considered carefully. You asked them for something without telling them what it was. Men don't like that. They need a specific thing they can say yes to. A vague ask is easier to decline because it doesn't have a shape. Ethan looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at her plate. She had thought the same thing and had not said it, because she had been picking her moments with Ethan Caldwell and had decided this was his lesson to encounter rather than one she needed to deliver. "What would you ask them?" he said. His voice was genuine, not defensive. That was a thing she had come to appreciate about him. When he was wrong and he knew it, he didn't spend much time protecting the wrongness. "I'd ask them to put their names on a letter," Margaret said. "Something specific. Something with Hector Blaine's language in it about the loan clause. If you're going to fight this in a way that can be won, you need paper. Paper with names on it means people have committed to something they can't quietly walk away from." Ethan was quiet for a while. That's a bigger ask than what I made. Yes, Margaret said. That's why it will work better. She picked up her fork and returned to her meal, and the conversation moved on, but Eliza saw Ethan sit with it for the rest of the evening, turning it over in the particular way he had of processing things that required him to revise something he'd believed. Hector Blaine had sent word 3 days after Eliza's visit. Not a letter, just a message through the boy who ran errands for the notary office, a kid of about 12 who delivered it with the gravity of a person carrying diplomatic correspondence. The message said only, "Come Thursday, bring him." Eliza had shown it to Ethan without comment. He had read it twice and then folded it into his shirt pocket, and she had understood that meant something to him. That Blaine was willing to include him rather than work around him, and she had let it mean what it meant without explaining it. They went to Blaine's office on Thursday together. The notary had spent the intervening days doing something with the loan documents that was evident in the way they were now organized on his desk, flagged at specific points, annotated in the close, precise handwriting of a man who had been doing this work for a very long time. He laid it out for Ethan directly, the same way he had for Eliza, but with additional detail now, because he had found 2 more clauses in the fine print of the second modification that had the same quality as the first. Language designed to look like standard banking terms while containing within it conditions that gave the bank unusual latitude. Ethan read the flagged section slowly. His face did not change much while he read, but his jaw tightened in a way that Eliza recognized. "This was written by a lawyer," he said when he finished. "An expensive one," Blaine confirmed. "And the man who brought me this modification, he told me it was routine, an adjustment to the interest schedule." "It contains an adjustment to the interest schedule," Blaine said. "Among other things." Ethan set the document down on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. "What does it mean, legally? Can it be challenged?" "I'm not a lawyer," Blaine said carefully. "What I can tell you is that a judge looking at this document would find the embedded clauses significant. Whether those clauses are enforceable as written depends on questions of disclosure that I cannot answer alone." He paused. "What I can do is certify in writing, as a notary public with 23 years of experience reading legal documents in this county, that in my professional judgment these clauses were not written to be clearly understood by a layperson reviewing the document in the normal course of a loan modification." "That's what you'd write?" Ethan said. "That's what I'd write." The silence in the office had weight. Eliza watched Ethan process the thing he was being handed, not the document itself, but what it represented. The fact that he had been cheated carefully and deliberately by someone with the resources to do it carefully and deliberately. That the defeat he had been experiencing for 3 years was not the result of his own failures of management or judgment, but of something constructed against him. "Do it," Ethan said. Not loudly, not with drama, just with the flat, certain authority of a man who has found the ground under his feet and knows where he is standing. Blaine nodded. "I'll need 2 weeks to write it properly. What I write needs to hold up if it's read by someone on the other side." 2 weeks, Ethan said. "All right." They left the office, went down the creaking staircase, and stood on the street outside. The ordinary life of Harrow moved around them. A woman with a basket, 2 boys arguing about something on the far side of the street, a dog sleeping in a patch of sun in front of the feed store. 2 weeks, Ethan said, not to her specifically. "We have 31 days left on the deadline," Eliza said. "It's enough, if the rest of it moves." "The rest of it?" He looked at her. "The neighbors. The letter." "Yes." He pushed his hat back slightly, which was a thing he did when he was thinking. "I'm going back to Alderman, and I'll go to the Fowler brothers again, even if they say no twice. I'll go to every ranch in the Eastern Valley if I have to." A pause. "Your mother was right. I was asking for sympathy. I should have been asking for something specific." "Don't tell her that," Eliza said. "She'll take it as permission to be right about everything else." He looked at her, and that involuntary almost laugh happened again. The one that surprised him every time it came out, like a piece of himself he kept forgetting was there. It was 4 days after the visit to Blaine that the cattle drive came into Eliza's knowledge. and it came in the way significant things often do, not from the direction you're watching. She was in the feed store, Harrow's feed store, which smelled of grain and leather and a specific brand of quiet judgment, picking up supplies. When she overheard two men talking at the counter with the casual volume of people who don't care who hears them. One of them was a trail boss she didn't know by name, a sunburned man with the build of someone who spent most of his life on a horse. He was talking about a drive going out in 9 days, heading northeast to the railhead at Gallows Crossing, 300 miles of rough country with a crew that was 2 men short because one had broken his leg and one had simply not shown up. Paying trail wages plus a bonus at the end, the man said. But I need a cook, and I need someone who can handle supply management, provisioning for 22 men across 3 weeks. His companion said something Eliza didn't catch. I know, the trail boss said. At this point, I'll take competent over experienced. I need someone who can think when things go wrong, not just follow instructions when they go right. Eliza paid for her supplies and went outside. She stood in front of the feed store, in the patch of sun where the dog had been sleeping, and she did the arithmetic that had assembled itself in her mind without her consciously directing it. 3 weeks. Trail wages, well, she didn't know the exact number, but she knew roughly from things Ethan had said in passing, plus a bonus at the end for a drive that made it through. And what did they still need? The debt amount that Blaine's certification alone could not retire, even if it gave them legal grounds to challenge. They needed money, actual money, to demonstrate to the court or to any legal proceeding that Ethan Caldwell was a solvent man defending his property, not a desperate man grasping at procedure. She ran the number in her head twice. It was not enough by itself, but it might be enough to make the difference between enough and not enough, and that was a different kind of problem, a solvable one. She walked back inside and asked the trail boss what the cook's wage was. He looked at her with the particular expression men got on their faces in that moment, the one that was part surprise and part evaluation and part an internal conversation that hadn't yet resolved itself about what to do with the information that this was not the kind of question he'd expected from this kind of person. Trail cook, he said carefully. You cook for 22 men in all weather for 3 weeks. It's not, what's the wage, she said. He told her. She did the arithmetic again. With the bonus, if the drive made the railhead on schedule, it was almost exactly what they needed. I'll come to your camp tonight, she said, and I'll cook you supper. You eat it, you hire me. He looked at her for a long moment. Ma'am, a cattle drive isn't... What you said is you need someone who can think when things go wrong. She held his gaze. Let me cook you supper. That evening, she made a meal from what was available at the camp he had set up outside town. She worked with what she found, stretched supplies that were poorly organized and partially spoiled, and produced, from those conditions, food that was not spectacular but was substantial and hot, and properly seasoned, which is what 22 men on a drive actually needed and which was rarer than people assumed. The trail boss, his name was Garrett, she learned over supper, ate in silence and then said, How are you with horses? Adequate. I'm not a drover. I don't need a drover. I've got drovers. I need someone who can keep those drovers fed and not dead, manage the supply wagon, and make decisions without coming to find me every time something breaks. I can do that, she said. You've cooked in rough conditions. I've lived in rough conditions, she said. Cooking in them is the easier part. He looked at her across the fire for a moment. You're from the Caldwell place. She didn't flinch. I work there, yes. People in town say Caldwell's on his way out. People in town are sometimes wrong, she said. He was quiet. The men on this drive aren't going to be polite about a woman in camp. Some of them will be actively difficult. I can tell them to behave, and they'll behave when I'm watching. When I'm not watching is a different matter. I understand that. And you're still asking? Yes. He thought about it for a while. The fire made the sounds fires make. Out in the dark, the herd shifted and settled. 9 days, he said. You'll be gone 9 days from now, and back in roughly 22 to 25, depending on weather and the river crossings. He paused. If we make Gallows Crossing by schedule, the bonus is real. If we don't, it's trail wages only. Understood, she said. She walked back to the Caldwell Ranch in the dark, carrying the decision the way you carry something heavy, carefully, aware of its weight, not letting it tip. She told Ethan and Margaret that night after supper. The response was not what she expected, which is to say it was not a single thing but several things at once, layered in a way that took her a moment to read. Margaret went very still. The specific stillness of a woman who was doing rapid calculations and had not yet arrived at the one she wanted. Ethan stood up from the table, not angrily, just stood, with the restless energy of someone who needed to be vertical while processing. "No," he said. "Ethan, no." He turned away from the table. "That drive is 3 weeks. It's rough country. Garrett's a decent trail boss, but his crew—" "I know what the crew is," Eliza said. "He told me." "Then you know why." "I know why you're going to tell me not to go," she said. "And I also know that we need approximately what this drive will pay me, on top of what Blaine's certification might free up, to actually have a fighting chance before that deadline." She kept her voice even. "I've been through the numbers twice. This is the number that makes the math work." He turned back. His face had the look it got when he was fighting between what he felt and what he knew. And she had come to understand that this was actually a sign of something decent in him. Not all men felt that particular friction. "There are other ways," he said. "Tell me one that works in 25 days. The silence that followed had an honest quality to it. He couldn't tell her one. They both knew it. "I've been handling hard situations for a long time," she said. "I know what I'm walking into. I'm not walking into it blind, and I'm not walking into it because I have no other choice. I'm walking into it because it is the choice that makes sense." He looked at her mother. Margaret had not moved from her stillness, but something had shifted in her face. The calculations had resolved into something, and what they had resolved into was not refusal. "She's right about the numbers," Margaret said quietly. Ethan looked at her as if this was a betrayal, though not a surprising one. "You'll stay here," Eliza said to her mother. "You keep the ranch going. The garden is close enough now. You know what it needs. Ethan knows what the fence needs. Between the two of you, I know how to run my own ranch," Ethan said, with an edge that was not entirely about the ranch. "I know you do," she said. Another silence. This one had a different texture, less like a wall and more like a door that was deciding whether to open. "If something happens on that drive," he started. "Then something happens," she said, "the same way something can happen here to either of you in any of the next 25 days. That's the frontier. We don't get guarantees." He sat back down at the table. Didn't say anything more. But he didn't say no again either, and with Ethan Caldwell she had learned that was as close as you got to a yes when the question was one he didn't want to answer. The 9 days before departure were the hardest kind. Days with too much to do and too little time for all of it, which meant everything got done imperfectly, which meant certain things didn't get done at all, and you had to decide which ones you could live with. Eliza worked the garden until it was in a state where Margaret could maintain it. She finished the section of fence she'd been working on the north side. She showed Margaret where she kept the notes she'd been making. Quiet notes. A habit from the dry goods store days, records of what had been repaired and what still needed attention and when the seeds had been planted and what they'd need. Ethan didn't say much during those 9 days. He worked, which was his way of communicating things he didn't know how to put into words. On the 8th day, he came in from the south pasture and found her in the kitchen going through the supplies she'd need to pack for the drive, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said, "The creek crossing at mile 40. Garrett will think he knows the best line. He doesn't. The north bank has a shelf of limestone under the surface that looks like solid bottom, but isn't. Tell him to cross 30 yards south of where he thinks." She looked at him. "You've driven cattle across that creek." "Twice," he said. "Lost 2 steers the first time because I trusted the obvious line." He paused. "Don't let him make the same mistake." "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and went back outside, and Eliza stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands resting on the supply list, thinking that this was how trust got built between people who were not naturally inclined to trust, not in large gestures, but in specific, useful information offered at the right time, which was a more intimate act than it sounded. The morning she left, Margaret walked her to the wagon in the gray pre-dawn. They stood for a moment in the cold air, and Margaret put her hand against Eliza's cheek briefly. a gesture so rare that it carried the weight of everything she wasn't saying. "You always did know how to pick the hardest version of a thing," Margaret said. "I learned it from someone," Eliza said. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Come back." "I will." Ethan was already in the yard. He had her supply bag in his hand, which he had apparently carried out from the barn where she'd left it, and he handed it to her without ceremony. Their hands overlapped on the strap for just a moment, and he didn't let go immediately, and she didn't pull away immediately. And in that brief overlap, she felt something. Not spoken, not resolved, just present, like a question that was being allowed to exist without being forced to an answer yet. "Don't trust Garrett's line on the creek at mile 40, he said. "You told me." "I know, I'm telling you again." She climbed onto the wagon. He stood in the yard with his hands loose at his sides and watched her go. And she did not look back because if she looked back, she would find a reason to stay. And the reason she had for going was real and necessary, and she needed to let it be both of those things without interference from what she was feeling. The cattle drive was not what Eliza had prepared for, which was itself the first lesson. You cannot prepare for a thing that has its own logic. You can prepare generally. You can prepare your supplies and your energy and your capacity to improvise. But the specific way a cattle drive beats you is its own education. The first 3 days were the kind of hard that was at least comprehensible. She cooked for 22 men on a fire that was either too hot or not hot enough, managed a supply wagon that had been organized by someone with no system, and operated in conditions where everything was dirty and loud and the dust got into everything, and by the end of each day she was exhausted in a way that started in her shoulders and ended somewhere behind her eyes. The crew was the other education. They were not, as a group, hostile. Garrett had clearly said something, which produced a baseline of professional tolerance that was better than nothing. But tolerant is not the same as welcoming, and she felt the difference acutely. There were looks exchanged over her head. There were moments of small, deniable difficulty. Supplies moved without explanation. A water barrel left unfilled that she'd asked to have filled. Not sabotage, exactly. More like testing. The kind of ongoing low-grade friction designed to determine whether you'd break or complain or give up, which would answer the question of whether you belonged. She did none of those things. She refilled the water barrel herself, without comment. She found her supplies and reorganized them without accusing anyone. She kept cooking, kept producing food that was hot and filling and on time, every meal, regardless of conditions. The man who came at her most directly was Cole Maddox. He was not the largest man on the drive, though he was large enough. What he was the loudest, the person whose opinion the others calibrated against, the kind of man who exists in every group of men working in hard conditions, serving the social function of determining what the group finds acceptable. If Cole Maddox said something was fine, it was fine. If Cole Maddox said it wasn't, it wasn't. He decided, sometime on the second day, that Eliza was not fine. He didn't say so directly at first. He said it indirectly, the way people do when they're gauging how much they can get away with. A comment at supper about the coffee being weak. A remark to the man beside him, pitched at a volume she was clearly meant to hear, about whether some people had any business being out here. The kind of thing that was hard to respond to without sounding like you were overreacting, which was itself the point. On the third night, he was more direct. She was cleaning up after supper when he came to the supply wagon for something he claimed he'd left in the back. He stood closer than he needed to, taking up space in a specific way that men use when they want to make clear how much larger they are than you. "I'm going to tell you something for your own good," he said. "All right," she said. She kept working. "This drive is no place for a woman. Garrett made a mistake bringing you out here. You should turn around at the next town and go home." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. He was waiting for something. He was used to a specific kind of response to this kind of approach, and he had his answer ready for it. "Cole," she said pleasantly, "when you find a meal out here that's better than mine, you let me know. Until then, I'm going to keep doing my job, and you're going to keep eating it." She paused. "You want something from the back of this wagon, or not?" His jaw went tight. "That's what I thought," she said, and went back to work. He left, but she felt him leave in a specific way, not defeated, but recalibrating. A man like Cole Maddox did not accept a first refusal as the end of it. It was just data. The real crisis came on the 7th day, at the river crossing. The Kettle River at that point in the drive was running higher than expected. She could see that from half a mile out, the way the current had a specific agitation to it that meant recent rain upstream. Garrett pulled up at the bank and looked at it with the expression of a man who needed this not to be a problem. "We go at the usual line," he said. "Stay together, move fast." Eliza was at the supply wagon, 40 yards back. She called out, "Garrett!" He turned. "North line is wrong. There's a limestone shelf 30 yards north of where you're planning to cross. It looks like solid bottom, but it'll drop. Cross south of your current position." He looked at her. Around him, 22 men waited. "Who told you that?" he said. It wasn't entirely a question. "Caldwell. He lost cattle there, twice." Cole Maddox said from somewhere in the middle of the group, "We're taking advice from a woman who's never driven cattle before." His voice had a lazy quality designed to get a reaction. "She's relaying information from a man who has," Garrett said, with unexpected flatness. He looked at the river, looked at the south position she had indicated, looked back at the north crossing he had used before. How sure was he? "Sure enough to tell me twice," she said. Garrett made a sound in his throat and said, "Move south, 30 yards." They moved south. They crossed. The wagon lurched on the uneven bottom and 2 steers balked and had to be pushed, and Eliza's heart was in her throat for about 6 minutes while the water came up to the wagon bed's edge, and she held the reins and talked to the horses in the low, specific voice her mother used with the chickens. But they crossed. All of them. All the cattle, the supply wagon, every man. On the far bank, while the cattle were settling and the men were checking their gear, Garrett came to the supply wagon. "There was a limestone shelf right where he said," he told her. "I could feel the line of it when my horse stepped close to it." "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't have to say anything. If we'd lost cattle and wagon at the north crossing, that's not your responsibility." "No," she said. "But it would have been my fault for not saying something when I knew something." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. Then he walked back to the front of the drive. After the river crossing, something shifted in the camp that was gradual enough to be almost invisible until it wasn't. The men who had maintained a civil distance began to close it slightly. Not warmly, not quickly, but the looks over her head happened less often. The deniable friction stopped. A man named Hester, who had not said a voluntary word to her in 7 days, came and asked if he could have a second helping of the corn pudding, which was not a remarkable request except that it was phrased as a genuine question rather than an assumption, which meant something. Cole Maddox did not apologize. Men like Cole Maddox did not apologize, and she had not expected one. What happened instead was more interesting. He started doing small things that made her job easier. He would pull the supply wagon to a better position without being asked. He hauled water twice. He said nothing about any of it. On the 10th night, he sat down near the fire while she was doing end-of-day inventory, and he said, not looking at her, that crossing could have killed 3 men. "I know," she said. Garrett should have known about that shelf. He would have if he'd lost cattle there himself. He hadn't. Cole was quiet. "Caldwell told you to tell us." "He did." Another silence. A man who tells the person going on his behalf how not to get other people killed. He didn't finish the thought, just sat there for a while with his hands on his knees. "That's a specific kind of person," he said eventually. "Yes," Eliza said, "it is." He got up and went back to his bedroll without saying anything else, and that was the last time he made her feel unwelcome on the drive. Not because he became her friend, he didn't, but because he had made a private reckoning and she had come out of it on the right side. The remaining days were hard in ways that were physical rather than social, which was easier to manage. A storm on day 14 that flooded the cooking area and required 3 hours of improvisation to produce anything edible. A steer that got loose and took 4 men and 2 hours to recover. A day when the supply wagon's rear axle developed a crack that she caught during her morning check, and which Hester helped her brace with materials from the repair kit, the two of them working in silence with the focused practicality of people who have agreed that the situation matters more than everything else. Each night, lying in her bedroll under a sky that was extravagantly full of stars, she thought about the ranch. She thought about the garden, and whether Margaret was managing the watering correctly in this dry stretch. She thought about the fence on the north side, and whether the stone anchors were holding. She thought about Blaine's certification, and whether it was finished, and whether Ethan had gone back to Alderman and the Fowler brothers with something specific to ask for this time. She thought about Ethan standing in the yard watching her leave, his hands loose at his sides. She put that thought down carefully each time it came up. There was work to finish first. There was money to earn, and a deadline to meet, and a man with bad intentions, and a lawyer who had written a terrible clause into a loan document, and all of those things needed to be dealt with before she had the right to sit with the other thing. But she noticed that she was thinking about going back in a way that was different from how she had thought about anywhere else she had ever left. She noticed, and she filed it, and she kept going. The drive reached Gallows Crossing on the 21st day, 2 days ahead of Garrett's conservative estimate. The cattle were counted, the bonus was calculated, and Eliza stood at the railhead office and received an envelope that contained more money than she had held at one time in her adult life, and she stood there for a moment just feeling the weight of it, not the money itself but what it meant, which was that she had done an impossible thing and it had worked, and the world was occasionally willing to acknowledge that. Garrett shook her hand at the railhead, not the handshake of a man being polite, but the handshake of a man settling a genuine debt of respect. "If you need work again," he said, "you come find me." "I hope I won't need it," she said. He laughed. "No, I imagine not." She was on the first wagon back toward Harrow the next morning, with her envelope and her exhaustion, and 21 days of accumulated road dirt and a clarity about certain things that had been building since the river crossing, and was now simply part of how she understood the world. The ride back took 3 days, and each one was longer than the last in the specific way that returns always are. When you know what you're going back to, distance becomes personal. She arrived at the Caldwell Ranch on an afternoon that was cooler than when she'd left, fall beginning to make its argument with the last heat of summer. She drove Biscuit up the track and saw, before she got to the gate, that something had changed about the yard. She couldn't identify it immediately, and then she could. The gate was open, and there were 2 wagons she didn't recognize parked along the fence line, and there were people in the yard, several of them, not Marcia's men. She could tell that from the posture, from the way they were standing. These were people who belonged here, or were learning how to. Margaret came out of the house when she heard the wagon. She came across the yard with the kind of walk she had when things were urgent, but not yet catastrophic, and Eliza stopped the wagon and climbed down. "What happened?" she said. "Blaine finished the certification," Margaret said, 3 days ago. Ethan took it to Alderman, and Alderman read it, and then Alderman called his brother-in-law, who's a justice in Callow County, and then—" She paused. "It started moving. Ethan's been going to every ranch in the valley, with the certification in his hand, asking them to put their names on a letter." She looked at the wagons along the fence. Some of them came to him instead. Liza looked at the yard, at the people who were talking among themselves with the careful, tentative energy of a group that was still deciding how much of itself to commit. "Ethan," she said. "In the barn," Margaret said. "He heard you come up the track." She walked to the barn. The door was open, and he was inside, and he was not doing anything particular, just standing there, the way she had found him standing in the yard that first evening, as if he was having a private argument with himself about what to do next. He turned when she came in. He looked at her for a moment. The road dust, the envelope in her hand, 21 days of a cattle drive written on her face in ways she couldn't see but could feel. "You made it," he said. "I made it." He nodded. Something was happening in his expression that was more than relief. It was the look of a man arriving at the end of a 3-week reckoning with what a particular person's absence costs, and understanding, for the first time clearly, what that means. She held out the envelope. "It's what we needed. Maybe a little more." He took it without opening it. "Blaine's certification is done. I've got 6 names on the letter so far. Alderman's brother-in-law thinks we have grounds." "How much time?" 10 days. She let out a breath. "Then we have 10 days. He looked at her. "Eliza." The way he said her name had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, careful, deliberate, like a man placing something he didn't want to drop. "Not yet," she said quietly. "There's still work to finish." He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded, the same reluctant, precise nod he gave when he was accepting something he couldn't argue with. "All right," he said, "come meet the neighbors." She walked out of the barn beside him, into the yard where 6 ranching families stood waiting, and the afternoon light came through the dry air, at the angle it got in early fall, and the gate was open, and the garden was green along every row, and somewhere in the house her mother was putting the kettle on, and Eliza Hale walked into the middle of all of it with the envelope in her hand, and 10 days left to win something she had decided, somewhere on a cattle drive under an extravagant sky. She was not going to lose. The 6 families in the yard that afternoon were not a coalition, not yet. They were 6 separate calculations standing in proximity to each other, each one working through its own arithmetic of risk and benefit. And Eliza understood immediately that the wrong approach would scatter them before they had a chance to become something more. Ethan introduced her to each of them in turn. The aldermans she knew, Ruth giving her a brief, warm look that contained 3 weeks of unspoken solidarity. The Fowler brothers, who were exactly what she'd expected from Ethan's description, 2 large men with the specific wariness of people who had said no once and were not entirely comfortable with the fact that they were now here anyway. A woman named Clara Petch, who ran a small sheep operation to the south and had the fierce, contained energy of someone who had been waiting for a reason to act and was careful about admitting it. A man named Douglas Harp, gray-haired and deliberate, who shook Eliza's hand with both of his and said nothing, which she read as genuine rather than cold. And a younger couple, the Bellamys, who had moved into the valley 18 months ago and had the particular alertness of people who were still learning which way the currents ran. She shook hands and said the right things, and she was aware the entire time of being evaluated, not hostilely. But these were people who needed to know what they were attaching their names to, and part of what they were attaching their names to was her, the woman Caldwell had hired, the woman who had gone on the cattle drive, the woman who had apparently done something at a river crossing that Garrett's crew was apparently talking about in town. Word traveled fast in a county this size. She had known that from the beginning. Ethan had set up a table outside, 2 sawhorses with a board across them, which was the Caldwell Ranch version of a conference room, and he spread out the papers there, the original loan document, the flagged clauses, and Blaine's certification, which ran to 4 pages and was written in the precise, measured language of a man who knew his words were going to be read by people looking for any reason to dismiss them. He talked. She listened mostly, which was a deliberate choice. This was his land, his case, and his neighbors, and it needed to come from him. She had spent the past 3 weeks understanding something that she hadn't fully articulated before, that her role in this fight was specific. She could do things Ethan couldn't do, see angles he couldn't see, and her presence had changed the shape of certain possibilities. But the fight itself had to be his, or it would fall apart the moment she was no longer standing next to it. So she stood slightly behind him and watched the faces of the 6 families and read them the way she had learned to read faces in 20 years of depending on reading them correctly. Douglas Harp was the first one to speak after Ethan finished. "I want to know what Blaine will do if this goes to a judge," he said. "It's one thing to write a certification. It's another to stand behind it in a room with Marcia's lawyer sitting across the table." "I can answer that," Eliza said. Everyone looked at her. She had waited for the right moment, and this was it. "I talked to Blaine before I left for the drive," she said. "He's been sitting on what he knows about that document for 2 years. He wrote the certification because someone finally asked him the right question, but he wrote it the way he wrote it, which is carefully and in specific professional language, because he knew it might end up in front of a judge. He's not a man who puts his name on something he's not prepared to defend." Harp looked at her for a moment. "You seem to know a fair amount about a notary's state of mind." "I spent an hour in his office," she said. "He's not hard to read. He's angry, and he's been angry for a long time, and he's been looking for a legitimate way to do something about it. What we gave him was legitimate." A small silence. Ruth Alderman said, to no one in particular, "That matches what I know of Hector Blaine." The conversation that followed was not smooth. It had the texture of 6 families working through their own fears in public, which is not a comfortable process. The Fowler brothers wanted to know what happened if they put their names on the letter and the challenge failed, what Marsh would do to properties that had signed on against him. Clara Petch said, with a precision that cut through the concern cleanly, that Marsh was already doing it without the letter, which was why they were standing in this yard having this conversation instead of staying home. The younger Bellamy husband said something about legal costs that revealed he hadn't entirely understood what Blaine's certification changed about the situation. And Ethan walked him through it again, and his wife listened with the focused intensity of someone who was making the decision while her husband was still processing the information. It went on for the better part of 2 hours. The light changed. Margaret brought out water and a plate of something she'd put together from the kitchen, and the act of people eating while they talked changed the temperature of the conversation slightly, made it less like a negotiation and more like a problem being worked on together. By the time the wagons began to leave as the afternoon got long, there were 8 names on the letter. The Bellamys had signed, which surprised Eliza. She had read the wife as the decision-maker and had thought the decision might take longer. Douglas Harp had signed last, with the deliberate care of a man who had been alive long enough to know that the signature mattered more than the sentiment, and who wanted to make sure those two things were in alignment before he put his name to paper. The Fowler brothers had not signed. They had said they needed more time, and they had taken a copy of Blaine's certification home with them, and Ethan had watched them go with the expression of a man managing his disappointment competently, but not without effort. 8, he said, when the last wagon had gone. 8, Eliza said. 3 days ago you had none. I know. He was quiet. The Fowlers matter. Their property is directly adjacent to the Eastern Creek. If Marsh gets the water rights, they're more exposed than anyone except aldermen. Then they know the stakes better than anyone, she said. Give them time to sit with it. Don't go back tomorrow. He looked at her sideways. I know, she said. But you'll crowd them. They need to arrive at it themselves. He made the sound that was almost a laugh, which had become, over the weeks, a reliable signal that she had said something accurate that he found slightly inconvenient. That night, Eliza sat at the kitchen table after supper, when Ethan had gone to the office to go through the papers again, and Margaret had gone to bed, and she counted the money from the drive envelope and set it beside the number she had written down weeks ago, the number she had done the arithmetic on, twice, in front of the feed store. The drive money, plus the amount Ethan had managed to hold in reserve against the debt. She looked at the two figures for a long time. It was close. It was not enough. She was still at the table when Ethan came back through, going to get water, and he saw her face before she could arrange it into something neutral. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She showed him the numbers without preamble. He looked at them. $60 short, he said. Roughly. He was quiet. If the legal challenge moves, the deadline might shift. If a judge issues a stay. That's if, she said. Yes. He rested his elbows on the table. I have equipment I could sell. The extra harness, That's another 40 maybe, not 60. I know. They sat with it. The kitchen was quiet around them, the particular quiet of late evening in a house where people have been working hard all day and the stillness is earned rather than empty. The stove had cooled. Outside, a wind had come up off the ridge, the kind that carried a first real suggestion of coming cold. The Fowler brothers, Eliza said after a while. Ethan looked at her. If they sign the letter, it changes the weight of the legal case considerably. And if the legal case is stronger, she paused. Do they have money in the bank? Not Marsh's bank, somewhere else. He thought about it. Callow County Savings. They've been with them since before First Regional existed. $60, she said. If the case is strong enough, and if they understand what they're protecting, I can't ask them to loan me money, Eliza. No, she said. You can't. She looked at him across the table. But I can ask Ruth Alderman if she knows someone who would consider a short loan against a property that is demonstrably worth more than the debt against it, now that the legal case has changed its position. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that was complicated. The pride of it, still, the difficulty of being the person who needed rather than the person who provided. She had watched him work on this for weeks, the slow revision of a man who had built his self-understanding around being self-sufficient, encountering a situation where self-sufficiency alone was going to lose. This county is going to remember, he said, that Ethan Caldwell couldn't manage his own affairs. This county, she said, is going to remember that Ethan Caldwell built a coalition of 8 families in 4 days and challenged a fraudulent loan document with a certified notary's testimony and won. She held his eyes. That's the story, if we do this right. You get to choose which version of yourself this situation makes. He was quiet for a long time. Talk to Ruth, he said. She did, the next morning. Ruth Alderman listened to the $60 problem over coffee at the Alderman kitchen table, while her husband was out on the property and they had the house to themselves. and she was quiet for a while when Eliza finished. "It's not the money," Ruth said. "My husband would say yes to $60 if the case is sound. He believes in the case now. Blaine's certification changed that." She turned her cup in her hands, a gesture Eliza recognized as Ethan's, as something people did on this frontier when they were thinking. "What I need to know is whether you're going to be there at the end of this, you and Caldwell." Eliza looked at her. "Not as hired help," Ruth said carefully. "I know you work there. I mean, whether this is something that lasts. Because if it is, the loan is easy. If you're going to be gone in 6 months, and Caldwell is going to be back to doing this alone." She didn't finish the sentence, but the shape of it was clear. "I'm not going anywhere," Eliza said. Ruth looked at her. "Does he know that?" "Not in so many words." Ruth made a sound. "Well," she got up to refill the coffee. "That's a conversation you probably need to have before you go into a bank together and challenge Doyle Marsh's financial interests." "One thing at a time," Eliza said. "Sure," Ruth said, with the tone of a woman who thought the ordering was wrong but understood she wasn't going to win that argument today. The $60 was agreed upon before Eliza left, with a handshake and a timeline tied to the outcome of the legal challenge. It was not a perfect solution. There was no perfect solution in this situation, only a series of adequate ones assembled in the right order. But it made the number work, and the number working was what they needed. She got back to the ranch to find Ethan in the yard, talking to a man on horseback. She didn't recognize a young man, professionally dressed for a frontier setting, with the organized quality of someone who was used to being in places on behalf of someone else. He was handing Ethan a letter. She waited until the rider left and then came across the yard. Ethan was reading the letter with his jaw tight. "What is it?" she said. He handed it to her without speaking. It was from First Regional Bank, signed by the bank manager, a man named Colville, whose name she had seen on the original loan documents. It was brief and formally worded, and what it said, beneath the formal language, was that the bank had become aware of an inquiry into the terms of the Caldwell loan and wished to advise Mr. Caldwell that the loan terms were standard and legally sound, and that any deadline associated with the note would be enforced as written. It further noted that the bank's legal counsel had been engaged, and that any documentation challenging the terms of the note would be reviewed and contested. They knew about Blaine's certification. Someone had told them. Eliza read the letter twice, and then she looked up at Ethan. Who knew about the certification beyond the people in this yard? He was already working through it. Blaine himself, his office, the writer he sent with the message. He paused. The families we talked to yesterday. The Fowler brothers, she said. His face went still in a specific way. They didn't sign, she said. They took a copy of the certification home. They wouldn't... He stopped. She watched him work through it, the way he worked through everything that required him to revise something he'd believed. No, I don't think they told Marsh directly, but if they talked about it to the wrong person, in a county this size, she said, that's enough. He turned away and stood looking at the fence line, and she let him stand there because there was nothing she could say right now that would be more useful than letting him feel the full weight of the thing and make his peace with it. After a while, he said, They've got a lawyer now. We expected that. We didn't have a lawyer. No, she said. We have Blaine's certification, 8 signatures, and a justice in Callow County that Alderman's brother-in-law contacted. She paused. That's not nothing, Ethan. It might not be enough. It might not be, she agreed. But we're not done yet. He turned back. He looked at her with the expression that had been developing slowly over 2 months, the one that was not about hope exactly, but was in the same neighborhood and had stopped being suppressed and started being accepted. 7 days, he said. 7 days, she agreed. What the letter from the bank had done, though neither of them said it quite this way, was clarify things. When an opponent shows you their position, it tells you what they're afraid of, and what First Regional's letter showed was that they were afraid of Blaine's certification reaching a judge before the deadline. The legal route, which might otherwise have been a slow process, filings, hearings, continuances, needed to be accelerated, which meant Alderman's brother-in-law needed to be not just contacted but moved. Ethan rode to Alderman's that afternoon. Eliza went with him, which was a decision made quickly and without much discussion. The kind of decision that was easy because they had both arrived at it from the same direction. George Alderman, Ruth's husband, met them with a directness that the situation had apparently simplified for him. He had read the bank's letter, Ethan showed it to him, and he made a sound that was not polite. "Colville's doing Marsh's talking for him," he said. "That man doesn't write a letter like this without being told to." "No," Ethan said. "My brother Harlan can get this in front of Judge Whitmore in Callow County," George said. "He's been sitting on the referral since I contacted him. I told him to wait until we had the signatures assembled. We have the signatures now. I'll ride to Callow County myself tomorrow morning." "That's a day-and-a-half ride," Ethan said. "I know how far it is," George said, not unkindly. He looked at the letter again. "Whitmore is not a man who likes what Marsh represents. He's had dealings with First Regional before. I'm not saying it's guaranteed. Whitmore does what the law says, not what he feels. But he'll read the certification, and he'll read those clauses, and he'll give it a fair hearing." "How long for a hearing?" Eliza asked. "A stay. A temporary order holding the deadline. He could grant that in a day if the documentation gives him grounds. Whether it holds past the stay depends on the full hearing." He looked between them. "But a stay would give you time. Time is what you need most right now." "Yes," Eliza said. George Alderman looked at her for a moment with the frank, measuring look of a man who has been revising his assessment of something over a period of weeks and has arrived at a conclusion. "You've moved things that have been stuck for years," he said. "I want you to know I see that." She didn't know what to do with direct appreciation from a man like George Alderman, who was not given to it. "Ethan moved them," she said. "Ethan built the foundation," George said. "You found the lever." He paused. "Anyway, I'll leave at first light." They rode back in the late afternoon with one more piece in position and 6 days left. The next 3 days had the particular quality of waiting that is worse than action. The waiting that contains irreversible things already in motion that you cannot speed or redirect. George Alderman was riding to Callow County. Blaine's certification was already filed with whatever Harlan Alderman needed to present to Judge Whitmore. The letter from First Regional's lawyers had been received, read, and included in the filing as evidence of the bank's awareness of the challenge, which Harlan Alderman had apparently said was useful in ways that were specific to the legal argument he was making. Eliza worked. It was the only antidote she had for waiting. She finished the last section of north fence on the second day. She turned the garden's outer rows, preparing them for the fall planting that the timing now made possible. She did an inventory of the barn that she had been meaning to do for a month, and had kept being displaced by more urgent things. And she found in the back, under a piece of canvas, a set of surveying equipment, a transit and rods and a chain, that was in good condition and which told her something about whoever had built this ranch before Ethan, someone who had intended to know their land precisely. She mentioned it to Ethan that evening. He looked at her. "Why?" "The water rights," she said. "The Eastern Creek. Do you have a legal description of where the creek runs through your property? In the original deed?" "The deed describes the eastern boundary by reference to the creek." "By reference, not by survey?" A pause. "I'd have to check the deed." They checked the deed. The eastern boundary was described by reference to the creek and a series of landmark trees that may or may not still exist as described, which was the legal equivalent of a handshake in the dark. It was not uncommon for properties of this age in this county. It was also, as Eliza laid out carefully for Ethan at the kitchen table that evening, a potential problem, because if the creek's exact path through the property had not been surveyed precisely, then the extent of the water rights was ambiguous, and ambiguity in a legal proceeding was something Marsh's lawyer could use. "We need a survey," she said. He looked at the equipment she had brought in from the barn. "I don't know how to use that." "I do," she said. He looked at her. "My father surveyed land," she said, "before he died. I went with him for 2 summers when I was young. I haven't done it in 20 years, and I'd want someone to check my work, but the basic principles don't change." She paused. "If we can produce a proper survey of the eastern boundary with the creek's exact position, we give the judge something specific rather than something ambiguous. It helps." "In 4 days," he said. "It's one creek boundary," she said, "not the whole property." He looked at the equipment for a long moment. "All right." They went out the next morning before the light was fully established. Eliza with the transit and Ethan carrying the rod, and she spent 40 minutes remembering things she had not thought about in 2 decades. The first readings were uncertain. She corrected herself twice, made Ethan move the rod back, recalculated. He did not say anything about the corrections. He moved when she told him to move and held the rod steady and waited with the patience of someone who understood that the work mattered more than the pace. By mid-morning, she had the eastern boundary mapped. By noon, she had the creek's position documented at 11 points along the property's edge, with measurements that anyone who knew surveying could verify. Her hands shook slightly when she wrote up the notes, not from fear, but from the accumulated effort of a task that required more precision than she'd remembered. And Ethan, coming back from where he'd planted the last rod, looked at her hands and then looked away without commenting. She appreciated that. "Who checks this?" he asked. "Blaine can certify the methodology if I describe it to him. And there's a land surveyor in Harrow. Older man, works out of the back of the hardware store. I've seen his certificate on the wall." "Bowers," Ethan said. "Can he be trusted?" "He doesn't like Marsh much. Had a dispute with him over a property line 6 years ago." He paused. "Most people in this county have had a dispute with Marsh over something." "Good," Eliza said. "Let's go see him." Bowers was a meticulous man who went through her measurements with the focused attention of someone who loved accuracy for its own sake and had strong feelings about it being done correctly. He found 2 minor errors, not in the creek position, but in the angle measurements of the boundary corners, which he corrected with the gentle superiority of a craftsman encountering someone who learned from a parent rather than a school. He had the corrected survey certified and signed by 3 in the afternoon, and when Ethan asked what he owed him, Bowers said, "Nothing. If that survey ends up in front of a judge and makes Doyle Marsh's day difficult, that's payment enough." They had the survey, the certification, and the letter of 8 signatures when George Alderman rode back from Calhoun County on the evening of the 5th day. He was tired in the specific way of a man who had ridden hard for 3 days and had not slept enough and was carrying news that he had been turning over in his mind for the last 12 hours. He sat in the Caldwell kitchen and accepted coffee from Margaret and said, before anyone asked, "Whitmore granted a stay." The room was quiet. "The stay holds the deadline for 30 days, George said. That gives time for a full hearing on the validity of the loan clauses. Harlan filed the certification, the signatures, and the survey with the application, and Whitmore said—" He paused, with the air of a man quoting carefully. "He said the survey was particularly persuasive in establishing the specific value of what the loan structure appeared designed to obscure." He looked at Eliza. That was his language, not mine. Eliza sat with that for a moment. The survey. She had found the equipment under a canvas by accident, had suggested it on an instinct about legal ambiguity, had done it on measurements she half remembered from 2 summers with a father who had died when she was 12. And it had apparently been the specific thing that moved a judge toward granting a stay. She did not say any of this. She just sat there in the kitchen of the Caldwell Ranch with her coffee and let the relief move through her without making a performance of it. Ethan was looking at her. "The hearing is in 18 days, George said. "Marsh will have legal representation. We should too." "Harlan?" Ethan started. "Harlan's a justice, not a lawyer. He knows someone in Calhoun County who does this kind of work. Challenges to loan terms, property rights. He says she's expensive and very good." He paused. "She'll want to see everything we have before she commits." "Then we send her everything we have," Ethan said. George finished his coffee and stood up with the careful movements of a man whose body was reporting on the ride. "The stay buys the time. The hearing decides it." He looked between Eliza and Ethan. "Get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow you start preparing." He left, and the 3 of them, Ethan, Eliza, Margaret, sat in the kitchen for a while afterward in a silence that was different from the silences before. Not the silence of people holding something difficult. The silence of people who have crossed a specific kind of distance and are catching their breath. Margaret said, eventually, "I'll make more coffee." It was the most Margaret thing she could have said, and it was exactly right. The following days were preparation in a form that Eliza had not done before. Not physical, not agricultural, but documentary. They assembled everything: the original loan, both modifications, Blaine's certification, the survey, the 8-signature letter, the bank's response letter, every piece of correspondence that touched the property. They organized it in the order Harlan Alderman suggested, which was the order a lawyer would need to read it to understand the case most clearly, and they sent it to the woman in Cowboy County. Her name was Ada Pierce, and her letter in response was brief and precise and contained, in its professional brevity, a confidence that was more reassuring than any number of warm words would have been. Ada Pierce wrote back in 48 hours. She wrote that the case had merit. She wrote that she had seen loan clause structures of this kind before, though rarely executed with this degree of deliberate obscurity, and that Blaine's certification was, in her assessment, unusually strong. She wrote that she would represent Ethan Caldwell at the hearing in Cowboy County in 16 days, and that her fee was a specific number which was large, but which, she noted, was recoverable as part of the proceedings if the challenge was successful. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down carefully. "She thinks we can win," he said. "She thinks we have a real case," Eliza said. "That's different." "I know the difference," he paused. "But she's seen things like this before and she took it. She didn't have to take it." That was true. It was the kind of thing that was easy to miss if you were looking at the words and not what was behind them, but Eliza had been looking at what was behind things for a long time, and she had caught it when she read the letter. 2 days before the hearing, the Fowler brothers came to the ranch. They came in the evening, unannounced, and they stood in the yard with the specific posture of men who have made a decision that cost them something and are at the stage of delivering it where they've committed but haven't quite arrived yet. The older one, his name was Chet, did the talking. "We heard about the stay," he said, "and we heard about the hearing." He looked at Ethan and then, briefly, at Eliza. "We should have signed the letter when you asked us. We know that." Ethan said, "The letter's done." "I know the letter's done. That's not why I'm here." Chet Fowler reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "We talked to Harlan Alderman this morning. He said the legal costs are real and that there's a shortfall even with the fee being recoverable on the back end." He held out the envelope. "It's not the full amount, but it's something." Ethan didn't move for a moment. Then he reached out and took the envelope. "Chet," he said. "Don't," Chet said. "We should have done it sooner. That's the end of it." He and his brother turned to leave, and then the younger one, Dale, who had not said a word, paused and looked back at Eliza. "That thing you did on the cattle drive," he said, "with the river crossing. Garrett's been talking about it." He paused. "That's the kind of thing that gets remembered out here." He walked away before she could respond, and Eliza stood in the yard and watched the Fowler brothers go, and she felt, in a way she couldn't have articulated without some effort, that something had completed a circuit. Not finished. The hearing was still coming, and the hearing was not a certainty. But something had closed that had been open, a gap between what people were and what the situation had been requiring them to be. And the closing of it had a specific sound, like the Caldwell gate swinging shut and catching properly on its hinge for the first time. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window, and outside the light was doing what fall light did in this valley, going golden and long and slightly melancholy, in the way of things that know they are changing. The garden was green against the dry yard, all its rows full now, the seeds she had planted in hope, during the worst of the uncertainty doing what seeds do, regardless of whether the circumstances around them are resolved, growing. Ethan came in behind her and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the same thing. 16 days, she said. 16 days, he said. She turned from the window. He was closer than she expected, which sometimes happened when neither of them was paying attention to the distance, and she had long since stopped pretending she didn't notice it. "When this is over," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, which with Ethan Caldwell meant he was saying something he had thought about a long time. "I want to talk." "About what?" He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read, the one that was not hope, but was what hope looked like in a man who had taught himself not to feel it too openly, working to become something more than a reflex to suppress. "About whether this is what it is," he said, "or something else." She held his gaze for a moment. "Ask me in 16 days, she said, "when we know." He nodded, and she could see, in the careful way he accepted it, that he understood the distinction she was making. Not reluctance, not uncertainty about what she felt, but the precise and necessary discipline of a woman who had learned not to let what she wanted interfere with what needed to be finished. She went to help Margaret with supper, and behind her she heard Ethan stand at the window for a moment longer before he moved, and the house settled around them with the quiet sound of people in it who had become, in the months since a wagon had come down a dusty track, and a woman had climbed out with $34 and a ham going bad, something that the house recognized as its own. The 16 days before the hearing did not pass quickly. That was the honest truth of it. They passed the way hard. Waiting always passes, unevenly, with some hours moving at a normal pace and others thickening into something that felt almost solid, and no reliable way to predict which kind of hour you were in until you were already through it. Eliza worked. It was still the only antidote she had, and she had stopped being self-conscious about needing it. She finished the fall planting in the outer garden rows. She repaired the storage room door that had been sticking since they arrived, which required more carpentry than she had anticipated and produced, in the process, a blister on her left palm that she wrapped with a strip of cloth and ignored. She organized the barn's tool storage into a system that would actually make sense in the dark, when you needed a specific thing quickly and couldn't afford to search for it. She did these things not because they were urgent, but because her hands needed to be doing something that had a clear result, and her mind needed the companionship of problems that could actually be solved. Ethan prepared for the hearing in his own way, which meant going through the documents again and again with the focused repetition of a man who needed to understand something thoroughly before he could trust it. Ada Pierce had sent a list of questions she would need him to be able to answer, and he worked through them at the kitchen table each evening after supper. And sometimes Eliza sat with him, and sometimes she didn't, and both arrangements were comfortable in a way that had developed gradually without either of them designing it. Margaret observed all of this with her characteristic precision and said very little, which Eliza knew meant she was saying a great deal. On the 12th day, a letter arrived from Ada Pierce. It was longer than her previous correspondence, which was itself informative. Ada Pierce was not a woman who used words beyond what a situation required. The letter said that Marcia's legal counsel had filed a counterargument asserting that the loan clauses were standard industry practice, and that Blaine's certification reflected personal bias rather than professional assessment. It said that the counterargument was not without merit on the surface, and that the hearing would require Blaine to speak to his methodology directly. It said, in its final paragraph, in language that was still controlled but contained something that might have been barely suppressed irritation, Mr. Colville's signature on the bank's original letter to your client, combined with his documented role in drafting the second loan modification, creates an evidentiary situation I find promising. I intend to subpoena the bank's internal correspondence regarding the modification process. She intended to subpoena the bank's internal correspondence. Eliza read that sentence twice and then handed the letter to Ethan. He read it. He read it again. She's going after what they said to each other when they were writing the clause, he said. If there's correspondence that shows they knew the language was designed to obscure, then it's not a mistake in drafting, he said. It's intent. Yes. He set the letter down on the table. Outside, a wind moved through the yard and the garden, and the sound of it through the gap under the door was the particular sound of fall establishing itself in a place where seasons mattered. She's better than I expected, he said. She took the case because she thought she could win it, Eliza said, not because she needed the work. He looked at her. You knew that when you read her first letter. I thought it was probable. He made a sound. Not the almost laugh, something quieter, more tired, more genuine. What else do you think is probable that you haven't told me? She considered the question seriously, because it deserved seriousness. I think it's probable that the hearing goes better than expected and worse than we hope. I think it's probable that Marcia's lawyer is very good and will make things uncomfortable. I think it's probable that Blaine will hold up under that discomfort because he's been sitting on his anger about this for 2 years, and anger, when it's cold and specific, is more durable than most things. She paused. I think it's probable that we win. Not certain. Probable. He was quiet for a moment. That's more than I had 4 months ago. Yes, she said. It is. The night before they left for Callow County, Eliza could not sleep. This was not unusual for her before significant things, but this night had a different quality to it, less the restlessness of anxiety and more the wakefulness of a person who is aware, consciously and specifically, that they are standing at a threshold that will move the story into whatever comes next, and who wants to be present for that awareness rather than asleep through it. She got up quietly and went to the kitchen and made tea, because it was too late for coffee and too early for anything else, and she sat at the table in the dark with the cup warm in her hands, and she thought about the woman who had ridden out of Millhaven 4 months ago with $34 and a wool blanket that smelled like cedar, and the specific, devastating certainty that her life as she had known it was finished. That woman had been right, as it turned out. The life as she had known it was finished. But the thing she hadn't understood, sitting in the back of the wagon watching the scrub grass flatten in the wind, was that finished and over were not the same thing. Finished meant the previous version had run its course. It said nothing about what came after. She had come to this ranch expecting to earn her place, which was what Ethan had offered and what she had agreed to, and she had done that. She had done it through the garden, and the fence, and the cattle drive, and the river crossing, and the survey equipment found under a canvas in a barn, all of it accumulating into something she hadn't been trying to build, and had built anyway. The way you sometimes build the most real things, not by planning them, but by doing the next necessary thing with enough care that the shape emerges on its own. She heard footsteps on the stairs, and was not surprised when Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the look of a man who had been awake for some time and had stopped pretending to be asleep. "Tea?" she said. "Sure." She'd made him a cup, and he sat across the table from her, and they were quiet together in the way they had gotten quiet together, which was comfortable without being resigned to itself. Outside, the night was clear and cold, with the kind of stars that only showed themselves when the air had enough chill in it to sharpen everything. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, after a while. "About tomorrow. About all of it." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "About what this place was like 4 months ago, before you came." He paused. "I was losing. Not just the money. I was losing myself, a little. Working, but not believing in the work. Going through the motions of a life that had run out of reasons." He looked at the cup rather than at her, which was the kind of honesty that required not looking directly at the person you were being honest with. "I didn't know that until something changed, and then I couldn't not know it." Eliza held her cup and did not say anything, because this was the kind of thing that needed room to finish itself. "What you did on that drive," he said. "What you did with Blaine, and the survey, and the neighbors, I could tell you it was for the ranch. I could tell you it was practical. It was practical, but it was also—" He stopped. Started again. "It was also someone caring whether this place survived, caring about what I'd built, even when it was falling apart. I didn't know what that felt like until I had it." She looked at him across the kitchen table. He looked up from the cup. "Ethan," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "After the hearing." "After the hearing," she agreed. And the way she said it, not as a dismissal, but as a promise, as a held thing, a specific thing, they were both keeping carefully until the other business was finished, settled between them with the weight of an agreement. He nodded, finished his tea. After a while he went back upstairs, and Eliza sat in the kitchen a little longer, in the company of the dark and the cold stars outside the window, and the particular peace of a person who knows what they are going toward, whatever form it takes. She slept before the morning came. They rode to Cowboy County in 2 wagons, Ethan and Eliza in one, George and Ruth Alderman in the other. Blaine had already gone ahead the day before, which he had communicated through the errand boy with his customary economy. The Fowler brothers had sent word they would attend. Clara Petch had sent a letter with George Alderman that she hoped would be useful, which Ada Pierce had already read and incorporated into the case in a way she described in a brief note as helping to establish community impact. The hearing was not in a courthouse. Cowboy County's courthouse was under repair after a fire the previous spring, and the proceedings were held in the largest room of the Cowboy County Hotel, which had been cleared of its normal furniture and arranged with a long table at the front for the judge and his recorder, and a set of chairs in rows facing it. It smelled of pine resin and old carpets, and the particular tension of a space where something important was about to happen. Judge Whitmore was smaller than Eliza had imagined, which was a thing she had learned to stop being surprised by. The people who hold the most authority are rarely the largest people in the room. He was in his 60s, with white hair and a judge's deliberate absence of readable expression, the cultivated neutrality of a man who had trained himself over decades to hear things and respond to the law rather than his feelings. He would have been difficult to read if she hadn't been watching him since before the hearing formally opened, and what she was reading was not his face but his hands, the way they stilled when something interested him, the way they moved when he was waiting for the interesting thing to arrive. Doyle Marsh was present. He sat on the far side of the room with two men Eliza took to be his lawyer and an associate, and he sat with the particular stillness of a man managing his reaction to a situation he had not expected to be sitting in. He had looked briefly at Ethan when they came in, and then at Eliza, and the look he gave her was different from the one he'd given Ethan. It was the look of a man recalibrating the source of a problem he had misidentified. She met it with the same directness she had brought to every assessment she'd been subjected to since the age of 24, which is to say completely. Ada Pierce was exactly what her letters had suggested, a woman in her late 40s who dressed with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that how you presented yourself in a room like this was itself an argument. She shook Eliza's hand with a quick, specific grip and said, without preamble, "Blaine is ready. I went through his testimony with him this morning. He's solid." Then she turned to Ethan and said the same thing about his role in the proceedings, which was to answer specific questions about what he had understood when he signed the second modification, and to do so concisely and without editorializing. "Say what's true," she told him. "Don't say more. The document makes the argument, not your feelings about it." Ethan looked as though he was not sure he liked that instruction, and then he nodded, because it was right. The hearing opened with the kind of procedural formalities that are necessary and tedious in equal measure. Judge Whitmore reviewed the documentation, the original note, the modifications, Blaine's certification, the survey, the letter of signatures, Ada Pierce's filing, and the bank's counter-argument. He reviewed it with the same unhurried thoroughness that he appeared to bring to everything, and the room waited while he read, which took time because he was actually reading. Marcia's lawyer was a man named Carver, from a firm in the capital that handled banking and property law for clients with the resources to hire a firm in the capital. He was polished in the way of people whose polish is genuine rather than performed, and he made his opening argument with the organized confidence of someone who had made similar arguments successfully before. The loan was standard. The clauses were industry practice. Blaine's certification was the work of a local notary with no formal legal training who had allowed personal history with the bank to color a professional assessment. The survey was not germane to the loan terms. The challenge lacked the evidentiary foundation to warrant the extraordinary relief of invalidating a legitimate financial instrument. It was a good argument. Eliza listened to it with the careful attention she gave to things that were capable of defeating her, which she had learned was the only way to actually understand them. Then Ada Pierce stood up. She did not raise her voice. She rarely did, Eliza suspected. She was the kind of advocate who understood that volume was the tool of people who needed to compensate for something and who had nothing to compensate for. She walked the judge through the clauses with the methodical precision of someone who had spent the past 2 weeks living inside those documents, and she identified, one by one, the specific ways in which the language of the second modification had been constructed to accomplish two things simultaneously: to appear, on a quick read, to be a routine adjustment, and to function, on a slow read by someone looking for leverage, as a mechanism for calling the loan at will. "This is not sloppiness," she said. "This is craftsmanship. And craftsmanship of this kind applied to a document that disadvantaged the signing party is the definition of the problem before this court." Then she called Hector Blaine. He was better than Eliza had hoped, and she had hoped well. He sat in the chair that had been positioned facing the judge's table with the particular composure of a man who had been preparing for this specific moment for 2 years without knowing it, who had filed away every observation about that document in a part of himself that had been waiting for someone to ask the right question, and now that the question was being asked in front of a judge, he could answer it with the full weight of everything he had been sitting on. He walked through his methodology without hedging. I explained what he looked for in a document of this kind and why, and he identified the exact paragraphs that concerned him and what specifically concerned him about them. And he said, when Carver attempted to characterize his opinion as personal rather than professional, in 23 years of notarial work, I have certified thousands of documents. I know what language designed to obscure looks like because I have been asked, on 7 prior occasions, to certify documents with similar characteristics, and on 4 of those occasions, I declined. This document I certified because my role required it. My professional judgment about what it contained, I kept. Those are different things, and I maintain both. Carver pushed on the personal history angle. Blaine acknowledged a prior professional dispute with First Regional without elaboration and without visible affect, and then said, If you're suggesting that dispute makes me incapable of reading a document accurately, I'd invite you to find an error in my reading of this one. There was a silence in the room following that. Then Ada Pierce introduced the subpoenaed correspondence. This was the moment Eliza had been waiting for without knowing its exact shape. The internal correspondence from First Regional, emails and memos between Colville and the bank's counsel, and in 3 specific messages, Doyle Marsh himself, had been produced under the court's subpoena 3 days earlier, and Ada Pierce had spent those 3 days preparing what she was about to present. She presented it quietly and in order. The messages were not dramatic confessions. They were the operational correspondence of people who assumed they were operating inside the law because they had paid someone to write the law in their favor, and who discussed the Caldwell loan with the casual precision of business people discussing a managed process, rather than the manipulation of a private individual's livelihood. There was a message from Colville noting that the modification language had been structured to provide maximum flexibility for acceleration. There was a message from the bank's counsel describing the specific circumstance under which acceleration could be triggered as purposely broad to allow discretionary application. And there was a message from Marsh to Colville, dated 6 weeks after Ethan had turned down his purchase offer, that said simply, "The Caldwell situation needs a longer solution. Talk to counsel about the modification schedule." The room was very quiet after Ada Pierce finished reading that last message into the record. Judge Whitmore had gone still in the specific way that Eliza had been watching for, his hands flat on the table, his attention completely concentrated. Carver was writing something quickly on the paper in front of him. Marsh, across the room, had the expression of a man discovering that the private language of his confidence had traveled somewhere it was not intended to go. Carver's response to the correspondence was competent and controlled, which was what you got when you hired someone from a capital firm. They did not crack under pressure, they adapted. He argued context and normal business communication and the distinction between managing a financial instrument and improper conduct. Some of it landed, not all of it. Ethan was called to speak about the modification signing. He answered Ada Pierce's questions with the exactness she had instructed him to bring. What he had been told when presented with the modification, what specific language had been pointed out to him, what he had understood the changes to mean. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He said what was true, and what was true was sufficient. When Carver cross-examined him, Ethan looked at him with the flat, patient expression of a man who had been doing hard work for a long time and had no interest in being made uncomfortable by someone whose hardest day was probably spent in an office, and answered each question directly without giving an inch of ground he had not already decided to give. Carver, after a few attempts to find an angle that wasn't there, moved on. The hearing had run most of the day. Judge Whitmore called a recess and went somewhere to think, which was what judges did, and the room broke into the specific movement of people who have been sitting tensely for hours and need to be upright and in motion. Eliza found herself standing outside the hotel in the cold air with Ruth Alderman, who was not given to nervous waiting but was doing a version of it. "How do you think it went?" Ruth said. "I think Ada Pierce did what she said she would do," Eliza said. "The correspondence was what it was. Whitmore saw it." Carver made arguments. "He did." She paused. They were good arguments for a normal situation. This situation stopped being normal when Marsh sent that message to Colville 6 weeks after Ethan turned down his offer. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "If this goes the wrong way, then we find another way," Eliza said. "But I don't think it's going the wrong way." She said it with a particular steadiness of someone who has run out of the luxury of doubt, not because certainty had replaced it, but because there was no more time for it. And the steadiness was a choice rather than a feeling. She had learned that distinction on a cattle drive in the rain, cooking for 22 men on a fire that wouldn't stay lit, and she had not unlearned it since. George Alderman came out of the hotel door and said Whitmore was back. They went inside. Judge Whitmore sat at the table with the same collected expression he had maintained throughout the day, and he spoke for approximately 12 minutes, and what he said was this. The evidentiary record established, in his assessment, that the loan modification clauses at issue had been drafted with the deliberate intent to create conditions for accelerated repayment that were not disclosed to the borrower in good faith. The internal correspondence of First Regional Bank confirmed that the motivation for the modification structure was not sound banking practice, but the commercial interest of a third party in acquiring the subject property. The certification of Hector Blaine, reviewed against the documents themselves, was credible and professionally grounded, and the cross-examination had not produced credible challenge to its substance. The survey of the eastern boundary established the specific value of the water rights at issue, which further supported the conclusion that the loan terms were structured with a specific acquisition goal rather than standard lending practice. The clauses in question were unenforceable. The outstanding loan balance, recalculated according to the terms of the original note without the fraudulent modifications, would be repaid according to the original schedule. First Regional Bank was ordered to provide a recalculated repayment schedule to Ethan Caldwell within 30 days. The legal fees incurred by Caldwell in this proceeding were recoverable from First Regional. He said all of this in the level, precise tone of a man who had thought carefully about what the law required and was now telling the room what it was. And when he finished, there was a moment of complete stillness before the room found its voice again, the way rooms do when something has been decided that was genuinely uncertain. Ethan sat in his chair without moving for a moment. His hands were on his knees, and he was looking at the table in front of him, and his face had the expression of a man absorbing something that is real, but that some part of him is still waiting to believe. Eliza sat beside him and did not touch him or speak, because this moment belonged to him and to the land and to however many years he had been working it alone, and it needed to be his before it was anything else. Then Ethan Caldwell raised his head and exhaled very slowly, and his shoulders did something she had never seen them do before. They let go. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to anyone not watching closely. But she was watching closely, and she saw it, and she recognized it as the release of something that had been held for a very long time. Marsh had already left the room. She didn't see him go. She only noticed afterward that he was gone, which was fitting in a way. Men like Marsh arrived with ceremony, and left when the ceremony stopped serving them. Carver was speaking to Ada Pierce at the front of the room with the professional civility of opposing lawyers who have finished their work and are now simply colleagues in a hallway, and Ada Pierce was responding with the same professional civility, and it was remarkably mundane for the end of something that had mattered enormously, which was also fitting. The important things rarely ended with the fire they carried in the middle. George Alderman shook Ethan's hand with both of his, the same gesture he'd used with Eliza weeks before, and Ruth Alderman put her arms around Eliza briefly and firmly, which was not a thing Ruth Alderman did lightly, and Eliza received it with the honest surprise of someone who had not been embraced by a woman who was not her mother in a very long time. Blaine found her before they left. He was putting on his coat in the corner of the room with the methodical care he brought to everything, and he paused when she approached, and she said simply, "Thank you. What you did in there. I know what it cost." He looked at her. "It cost less than doing nothing would have," he said. "I want you to understand that. 2 years of doing nothing cost more than this did." He put on his hat. "Besides, I was right. Being right and saying nothing about it is not something I'm going to do twice." She watched him walk out of the room, and she thought about what it meant to be right for 2 years and have no occasion to say so and to carry that specific weight. And she thought about all the things she had been right about over the years that she had carried similarly, without occasion. And she felt something for Hector Blaine that she had not expected, a kind of recognition, the kind that crosses the ordinary categories of acquaintance. Ada Pierce caught her at the door. "You found the survey equipment," she said. It was not a question. "Under a canvas in the barn." "It made the difference," Ada said. "Not the only thing, but the specific thing that showed Whitmore the concrete value of what Marsh was after. It made the whole story visible in a way that documents alone don't always manage." She paused. "You didn't have a legal background. How did you know to do it?" "I didn't know," Eliza said. "I knew the water rights were the real issue. I knew ambiguity was a problem in a legal proceeding. I had a father who surveyed." She paused. "Most useful things are a combination of knowing something and happening to have what you need." Ada Pierce looked at her with an expression that was not entirely professional. Something more personal in it, more direct. "If you ever find yourself looking for different work," she said, "I could use someone who combines those things." Eliza smiled. It was the real kind, the one that started somewhere behind her eyes. "I'll remember that," she said. "I don't think I'll be looking." Ada Pierce nodded once, with the quick, specific acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly what that meant and went to speak to the judge's recorder. The ride back to the Caldwell Ranch took the better part of 2 days. They stopped for the night in a town small enough that it had one inn and ate a supper that was undistinguished and sufficient, and the four of them, Ethan, Eliza, George, Ruth, sat at the table for a while after eating in the particular companionship of people who have been through something together and don't need to talk about it continuously to feel its weight. George talked about his property, what this meant for the Eastern Creek, what the downstream implications were for the other families. Ruth talked about Clara Petch, who had called the outcome before it happened with the confidence of someone who had made her calculations early and had not revised them. Ethan said relatively little, which was his nature, but the silence he brought to the table was not the silence of a man closed off. It was the silence of a man present and listening, which was a different thing and one that Eliza had come to understand took some people a long time to learn to distinguish. She slept that night without difficulty for the first time in 2 weeks. They came back to the ranch on an afternoon that had gone cold and clear in the way of deep fall. The sky a specific shade of blue that only existed after the heat was entirely gone. The garden was gold and brown at its edges now, the things that had finished their season doing what finished things do, and the center rows still held the green of the fall plantings she'd put in during the waiting period. The gate opened smoothly. The barn door was plumb. The house stood the way it had always stood, in its good timber bones, but it stood differently now. Not differently in fact, but differently in what she knew when she looked at it, which amounted to the same thing. Margaret was in the kitchen when they came in. She heard the wagon and came to the door and looked at their faces. And she read what was there with the speed of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading faces accurately, and she said, "Good," and went back to what she was cooking. That was the whole of her response, and it was complete. Ethan fed the horses and Eliza helped, and they worked in the easy silence that their shared silences had become. And afterward, when the barn was closed and the tools were put away, and the cold was settling in earnest, they stood in the yard as they had stood in it many times before, looking at the fence line and the garden and the open land beyond. "I want to talk," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He was not a man who performed emotion. She had known that from the start, from the first morning when he had taken the coffee cup without looking up and said 2 words about the fence. What he felt was in him the way the structure was in the house, foundational, not decorative. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as hired help. I want you to stay because I would like to build something with you that—" He stopped. Started again, which was one of his tells when he was being more honest than came naturally. "I haven't wanted to build anything with anyone in a very long time. I'd stopped thinking that was a thing that was available to me. And then you climbed down from a wagon in my yard and asked me about fence posts, and I realized—" A pause. "It's slow. It's been slow. But it's been real. And I want to know if you want the same thing." Eliza looked at him in the cold afternoon light, in the yard of the ranch that she had repaired and planted and fought for. And she thought about the woman in the wagon who had known her life was finished, and she thought about how right that woman had been and how much she had gotten wrong at the same time. The life was finished. It had made room for this one. "I want the same thing," she said. He nodded. Once, with the same careful weight he brought to every acknowledgement of something real. And then, because he was Ethan Caldwell and extravagance was not in his nature, he reached out and took her hand in the cold air, and they stood in the yard together for a while in the particular warmth of people who have worked very hard and arrived somewhere worth being. They went inside when the cold made staying out impractical, and Margaret had supper on the table, and the kitchen smelled of the things that kitchens smell of when they have become fully themselves: food and warmth, and the accumulated presence of people who are living deliberately in a space rather than simply occupying it. The winter that followed was hard in the ordinary way, which meant it had its share of difficulty and also its share of the kind of days that make difficulty worth enduring. The recalculated loan statement arrived from First Regional at the end of November. The original terms, without the fraudulent modifications, with a repayment schedule that was demanding but achievable, and which Ethan reviewed at the kitchen table with Eliza beside him and a pencil in his hand, going through the numbers with the focused calm of a man who now knew exactly what he was dealing with. The legal fees recovered from the bank covered Ada Pierce's costs entirely, and left a small surplus that Ethan, after a conversation with Eliza that lasted most of a Sunday morning, put toward the equipment that the ranch needed most. He returned $60 to the Fowler brothers with a note that was brief and without elaboration, which was the correct way to do it, and Chet Fowler came by 2 weeks later and handed back 20 of it and said to put it toward the fence, which needed more work, and Ethan accepted this with a nod, and the specific look of a man who was learning that accepting help gracefully was itself a skill worth developing. Ruth Alderman came by in December with a pie and stayed for the afternoon, and she and Margaret talked in the kitchen with the particular ease of two women who have recognized in each other something compatible, and Eliza sat with them for part of it and did other things for the rest, and felt, each time she passed through the kitchen, the warmth of a house that had filled itself with people rather than being filled by them. Doyle Marsh did not disappear from the county. Men like Doyle Marsh do not disappear from counties. He remained, and he still had money and interests and the specific social weight that money and interests produce. But the shape of what he could do had changed. The internal correspondence that Ada Pierce had entered into the record was not sealed. It was public, in the way that court records are public. And while most people would never read it, the people in this county who mattered to the situation had read it or had been told about it by someone who had. What had been known informally and privately, that Marsh was a man who shaped the instruments of commerce to serve his own ends, was now documented. Documentation is not the same as justice, but it is different from silence, and the difference matters more than people who have never depended on it can fully understand. There were people in Harrow who warmed to Eliza more quickly than she had expected after the hearing, and people who stayed exactly as they had been, and a few who had been cool, who stayed cool out of loyalty to Marsh, or out of the simple human capacity to resist revising an opinion you have held for a long time. She accepted all three categories with the equanimity of a woman who had stopped needing universal approval some years back and had not missed it significantly. She was not the topic of conversation she had been when she arrived. She was becoming, slowly and without ceremony, simply a person who lived and worked in the county, which was what she had wanted and which was more valuable than it sounded. The spring planting was the one she was most proud of in the end. Not because it was the largest or the most impressive, it wasn't by any measure a farmer would apply, but because it was the first one where the planting had been done in winter, in advance, with the specific knowledge of what the soil wanted in each section of the garden and what the growing season in this valley allowed. She and Ethan had spent evenings at the kitchen table with seed catalogs and a map of the garden she'd drawn herself, arguing pleasantly about the merits of specific varieties and the allocation of space, and Margaret had occasionally contributed an opinion from across the room without looking up from her mending, and those evenings had the quality of something she had not known she was looking for until she was inside it, the ordinary substance of a life shared with people who were paying attention. The garden that spring produced more than the ranch needed, which was not an accident. Eliza had planned it deliberately, surplus that could be shared with the families who had signed the letter, who had taken a risk in a hard season and deserved to benefit from what that risk had helped protect. She drove the surplus out to 4 properties in a wagon on a May afternoon that was the kind of mild and golden that makes you grateful the winter was as hard as it was, because you wouldn't be able to feel the contrast otherwise. Ruth Alderman stood in her doorway and looked at the wagon and said, "You didn't have to do this." And Eliza said, "I know." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. It is worth saying something in the end about what this kind of story asks of you. Not as a lesson, because lessons handed to you by someone else rarely stick the way the ones you earn do, but as an observation from the outside of it. Eliza Hale was not a remarkable person in the ways that tend to get noticed. She was not beautiful in the way stories usually require, not dramatic in her suffering, not possessed of any unusual gift that set her apart from the ordinary run of human beings trying to make something of the material they'd been given. What she had was simpler and harder than a gift. She had the capacity to do the next necessary thing, again and again, in conditions that gave her every reason not to. She had the capacity to let people matter to her without requiring them to be more than they were. And she had, somewhere under all of it, the stubborn and occasionally inconvenient conviction that she was not finished until she decided she was, that no person and no institution and no accumulation of failure had the authority to make that determination on her behalf. That is not a lesson. It is just what she was and what she chose to keep being, which is sometimes the hardest version of the same thing. On a morning in late spring, Eliza stood at the kitchen window in the early light with her coffee and looked at the garden and the fence and the yard and the land beyond it, opening up into the valley, green in the way it only got for a few weeks a year before the summer turned it back toward gold. The gate was open because Ethan had gone out early to check the south pasture and had not come back yet. The coffee was the way she made it, which was stronger than Ethan preferred and which he drank anyway. The kitchen behind her had the warm smell of morning in a house that was lived in, and somewhere above her she could hear her mother's careful steps on the floor of the room that had become, over the past months, more home than the house in Millhaven had been in 20 years. She thought, briefly, and without the pain it used to carry, about Victor Hale pointing toward the road with a lantern. She thought about the wagon, and the wool blanket, and the $34, and the ham going bad in the cloth. She thought about the woman who had arrived in this yard with nothing but the knowledge that her previous life was finished and the uncertainty of what that meant for what came next. She looked at the garden, at the fence, at the gate open on its good hinge. She did not think the word home the way you think a word you are noticing for the first time. She thought it the way you think a word that has been true for a while and that you are simply catching up to, quietly and without surprise, and with the particular gratitude of a person who has been paying attention. The gate swung wider as Ethan came back through it from the south pasture, and he raised a hand when he saw her at the window, the simple gesture of a man returning to a place that was expecting him. And she raised her coffee cup in return, and the morning went on around them the way mornings do when the hard part is over, and the living is the main work left to do.